Okay, we're live.
It worked?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, just don't touch the cord. I'm gonna put it down.
Free run, really wanted it to happen, they just make a note. There's 15,000 unemployed former employees who go make flatter or whatever, cleaner. That was on my list of things to like catch up on today, we're gonna go on Twitter, but. Yeah. Yeah, it's gonna become so much.
I was literally trying to have it.
Oh, yeah.
Tweets.
Oh. You can always just grab whatever and edit it later.
I did.
Just, yeah. I mean, certainly not for organizing product. There is such a thing as fair use. And I know that they really work on theirs and stuff, and so,
It's like church, nobody wants to sit in front.
Thank you for forging a path.
I've always been in front bench.
Yeah, I did look at some fair use work. For music scholar and music, because I'm such a. Yeah, I've definitely seen that. Image of yeah. Yeah, I just did that FTX or whatever, the crypto thing, did you read this article where journalists just had a direct interview with him? He was just like, okay, yeah. It's like, this is all the way into evidence. Yeah, but he was just like, you don't understand. Everybody's doing what's wrong. I just think we'll be looking at different accounts and I lost track of $200 million. So what? I mean,
Did you see the thing was great?
I did, yeah. So I sent it out to the whole.
Oh, great.
Just we were talking about it's oddly good. Yeah, yeah.
He's been a lot of great stuff.
Okay, good. Yeah.
He's been,
Have you talked to Martha today?
yeah, she's back, but she was talking about.
Yeah. I sent her a text message and she's,
We did it last year. We did that.
well, yeah, but I'm
That
wondering.
was kind of what I was understanding. I don't know what else to do.
Yeah,
We served things. It's sort of a, you know.
yeah, more. Tell me which class this is.
I don't know the details. I mean, I usually pick her up at the airport, but she must have made her own plans this time.
I'm sure she rented a car.
She
She's gonna be the one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sure there's other family that are coming now and all that. Yeah, but she did tell me that there was house that I was living there now. No, she's just gonna get a smaller room.
So they usually have their name and address.
Maybe something over there.
Okay, right.
They're Niles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian said, did you see that?
I haven't checked, I can check my email right now, but I didn't get, I didn't get.
Are you getting stuff about resolution or mostly that?
All over the place, yeah.
Okay.
I'm known by many names. I'm known by many names. I'm actually going to decide here. So I was gonna say, 50 years and then that's one by action for the community research and virtual justice. Try to keep accessibility and social justice.
Was this?
No,
Okay.
no, this is just about history of history class. There are going to be times for a moment of silence. Yeah. I'm a single, right. Right, I mean, yes, it is true. Oh, there's so. Perfect. It was It was completely insane. So it's sort of kind of losing my mind. Because when you're in that space, you're trying to and then I came home, I looked down and I was like, oh, it was a very kind of 70s consciousness raising kind of program. But even that was always a precondition for political action, right? And this was not, this was very strange. Oh,
We
no!
got teachers especially about
US and might be acting, the donor, and then we could use that was very interested in intersection of 20th century, higher history. They did want to have local history, and they didn't talk about, I thought this would be a nice, kind of application. It was last night was historical analysis, educational analysis, which is a Google find parts of you in our. No, they were, it was just. But it was like this. Yeah, I do. I do think that I always do my courses, my own research, so that's what I'm using. And it's just basic. And what does it? Like pushes the sense, right? Creates a sense of difference and grievance that makes it doesn't be regular. So that is true, and it always comes up, and there's always this word that has to happen. Well, that doesn't do just gather around. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I used to be teaching course. I used to and it was in the history course.
Oh, no. That's my professional graduate for tenure as we speak.
Yeah, I organized my work in projects and I'm going to supportive effort, they were talking about. So when I came out for my first time to teach, we looked at how to make plans for finding a job.
Right. So right.
I just hadn't published it. I started in research law, so just because I didn't think it was wrong.
And you know, now that we're together, and stuff that I was fighting about as a kid, you know, and I'm not sure it's very hard, but it also exists, and so it was just weird.
Right. This is what.
It is. Yeah, we choose this and look
Yeah,
at
it's water, just to get a little warmer.
It's Bindas, is that?
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. I guess I'll start with a quick disclaimer, which is that we are live streaming to YouTube. So just FYI, what we say is out there in the interwebs. Thank you again for coming. My name is Amy Fluker, and I am the Reader Professor of U.S. History here at Youngstown State University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's roundtable discussion on labor and the working class in U.S. history. This event is sponsored by the Reader Endowment and by the YSU Center for Working Class Studies, as well as the Youngstown Solidarity Network. So thank you once again for coming, and thanks to this evening's partners. Labor and working class history is so essential to the story of YSU, so I'm really excited to be able to host this event this evening. In fact, our Center for Working Class Studies was the first academic program in the US to focus on issues of work and class, and I think that's a real point of pride for us. Since 1996, it has remained committed to increasing awareness of working class life and culture through education, arts, media, and research. And it's hard to imagine a better setting for tonight's discussion than the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor. So I particularly want to thank Dr. Marcel Wilson, the director, and the students and staff who are keeping the doors open for us this evening. But before we get started tonight, I did want to acknowledge some sad news from yesterday. As many of you may know, Staunton Lind passed away at 92. A long life and a life devoted to protecting the rights of others. Lind was a historian, a lawyer, and an activist, probably best remembered here in the Mahoning Valley for his efforts to assist local steelworkers fighting the closure of Youngstown's mills following Black Monday, September 19th, 1777. And in fact, he wrote on that very issue to fight against the shutdowns. So our thoughts are with those who knew and loved Staunton, especially his wife and constant collaborator, Alice, and this community will certainly feel his loss. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists. We're missing one, and I'm assuming it's perhaps due to weather. Dr. Stephanie Shaw was planning to join us from Ohio State University in Columbus, so hopefully Dr. Shaw may still make it. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kenneth Bindas, who I would like to welcome home to Youngstown, but he's joining us this evening from Kent State University. His research focuses on the Depression era in the 1960s, exploring how the people redefine themselves, their government, and society in this era of change. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Modernity and the Great Depression, The Transformation of American Society. And also we have Dr. Gregory S. Wilson, who is professor of history at the University of Akron. His research and teaching interests include modern U.S. history, especially public history, political economy, environmental history, Ohio history, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. Along with various articles, he's the author of Above the Shots, an oral history of the Kent State shootings, Communities Left Behind, the Area Redevelopment Administration, 1945 to 1965, and the co-author of Ohio, A History of the Buckeye State, a tried and true textbook, which I use all the time. So with that said, I would like to begin just by asking our experts to share a bit more about themselves and their research, and then I have a few questions to put to you, and hopefully our audience may have some questions for you as well. So I'll turn it over.
Well, thank you, Amy, for inviting me to talk, and to the Reader Working Class Studies for this opportunity. I was born and raised in Youngstown, just up Mahoning Avenue on the west side, over by Ward's Playground. You know where that is. It used to be a playground. It's just a field now. Our people came to this place in the 1920s from what is today Slovakia. Our grandfather came in the time before World War I and worked in coal mines in Martinsburg, South, and then after the war came here and established a Slovak community with the Slovak community over by Holy Name Church over on the west side of Youngstown. He's a steel worker, worked in steel mills his entire life. My father and his brothers all worked in the steel mills variously. My father graduated from high school during the Korean War in 1952, immediately went to the mills. Literally the next day after he graduated, took a job in the mill. His father took him down to the mill, introduced him to the foreman, and he started working in sheet tube at that time. He later quit to go into the Navy, got out of the Navy, came out with 2 kids, went back to the mill, and then when General Motors Lordstown opened up in 1964, took a job out of General Motors and worked out there the remainder of his life. In 1977, my brother Frank and I both were fortunate enough to get hired at General Motors Lordstown. Our dad pulled strings, got us and a couple of cousins jobs there. 1977 is a very bad year for employment in Youngstown, so we were incredibly fortunate to get the job working at the assembly line. Up to that point, I had no real understanding what working class meant. I went to Youngstown Cheney, went to parochial school till 8th grade. It was just your life, you know, different people had different things, and you never saw what the issue of class was. Everybody seemed to be the same. You know, we all seem to be not struggling, but we all seem to have the same limited nothingness that everyone else had. It didn't seem to be a problem. But when I got to General Motors, it's when I began to realize what working class meant. And, you know, Jefferson Cowie, I'm going to read something from Jefferson Cowie. If you've not read this book, it's called Staying Alive. And it's about working class ideology in the 1970s. And when I read this book, it really resonated with me because it reminded me of my time at General Motors. I worked at General Motors from 1977 to 1981 on the assembly line. And it's there that I really began to develop a consciousness of being working class and what that meant within my community. Now, I'll read you what he said. By the 70s, he writes, it became clear that the immense institutional achievements of the previous generation, the generation of the 30s and 40s and early 50s that fought for unionization of the United Steelworkers of America. It became clear that the immense institutional achievements of this previous generation were both the sources of power as well as a system of constraint on the future fortunes of the American working class. And what he says there, and what happens in the book, is that in the early part of the 70s, there seemed to be a moment where the working class or the union representatives seemed to be gaining power, seemed to be moving forward, and things began to collapse around 1975, 1976. Youngstown and the deindustrialization that happened here, part of the domino effect that began to happen. And so what happens is the immense institutional power of the unions, the UAW, in my case at General Motors, you know, they were more interested in maintaining their position of power than working for union members' rights. And as a young 18, 19, 20-year-old working in that factory, and oftentimes in conflict with my union representatives as well as my foreman and general foreman, it really began to dawn on me that there was some sort of structure in America that was designed to keep me silent, to keep me quiet. And it was at that time that the guy I worked with right next to me, who was also a young guy like myself, 18, 19 years old, we started listening to, when we got through, Bob Dylan, and that quickly turned into the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Buzzcocks, and we became punk rockers. We started to play music. And it's through punk rock that I really developed a working class consciousness. And not American punk rock, not the Ramones, not Blondie, not even the Dead Boys, but British punk rock, because British punk rock was very focused on labor, on working class identity, and developing an identity in the structure of society that maintains a division between the managerial class and the working class as they operated. And later, once I got my PhD, I wrote an article on that, about the clash and the idea of working class ideology in punk rock music from Britain, and how that differentiated from punk rock music that came out of New York City, and then later in California with bands like Black Flag and Henry Rollins and all those guys that came out of California, sort of the speed metal that came out there. So it's really punk rock that really fashioned my working class ideology. And then I formed a band and we played lots of music and had lots of fun, and that was all really cool. And then I went to graduate school, and that's where I read about what working class ideology is. I took a course, I went to graduate school at the University of Toledo, and I took a course in Marx and Lenin in the philosophy department, and really began to understand what alienation meant as a working class person in America at the time, particularly Marx, less Lenin. But certainly Marx in the Gran Visa really sort of focused my ideas of what working class meant and how that operated in our society. And so when I got out of graduate school and started my first job, I wanted to speak to that identity, to try to explore how that operated in the 1930s, because that was my era that I was working in. And so I wrote 2 books that really resonated with this working class. And the first book is on swing music. It's called, I have to write it down because I don't remember the name of my own book. It's called Swing at Modern Sound, the cultural context of swing music. And it's not a musicology book, it's a book about the musicians themselves and the culture in which they operated. And one of the things that really defines swing music is class identification. The musicians who played in these bands, whether they be Jewish or Catholic or black or white, they all came from the same working class backgrounds, and it's that idea of class that unified them as musicians in their ability to make music. And the second book I wrote is about called Remembering the Great Depression in the Rural South, and this was based on oral histories my students and I did when I taught in Georgia, and we interviewed working class people in Georgia, rural working class people in Georgia who had lived through the Great Depression. And that book's about, how class identified their understanding of the Great Depression and their guilt that they felt that they couldn't do anything about the Great Depression, that somehow it was partly their responsibility, and that was, added on by Roosevelt, who said it's the South's fault because they were under consuming. So, I mean, they really, accepted the idea of alienation of their failure. And then I got a job at Kent State Trumbull campus out in Warren and Champion. And that was the first time I really taught working class students. Because in Georgia, they may have been working class, but they came out of Atlanta, so I didn't really quite understand their working class understandings, but certainly in Warren I did. And most of the students in Warren, since they were part-time students, non-traditional students, a lot of them had internalized the failure of the closings. They really were almost specimens of what Marx talks about in the internalization, the acceptance that somehow it was their fault that the mills had all closed. Somehow it was their fault that the Rust Belt situation had happened to them, and that they didn't deserve anything better than the poor set of cards they were dealt with. And so it was very exciting to teach them and work with them. And while we were there, we did an exciting project which Stott and Lind helped us do. And it's a documentary that we did on, it was called Invisible Struggles, The Stories of Northern Segregation, which aired on PBS way back in 2007. And this was a story about how Warren operated as a segregated city between 1954 and 1964 through oral history by interviewing African Americans as well as white residents of Warren during that time period, and comparing their different understandings of what race meant in that town and how class operated within that structure. And it was very exciting for the students to be participating in this, and it really allowed them to see what they had to offer coming from working class or poor backgrounds in order to contribute to this understanding of their community and really come to understand their community. I've written other things about class as well, but those are the ones I wanted to hit on. And I want to leave with just one last quote from George Lipsitz. If you've not read Rainbow at Midnight, it's a really good book, classic book from '94, so it's a bit old, but it still resonates. He says in this book, he says, the erasure of working class from the public consciousness hides the disaster that in deindustrialization, economic restructuring, and computer-generated automation have brought to the majority of populations. And that was written in 1994. That's a long time ago. I can't even figure out the years. 26 years ago, right? Yes, I'm in history. 26 years ago, he wrote that, and that quote, I think, resonates still to this day in terms of this institution is building and a program like this to try to remind us of the importance of working class in American society. Thank you.
Well, I don't have a Youngstown origin story.
Oh,
I'll make one up. I'm a historian. I tell stories. Now, but my family, my family was not one that went to college. They were all fairly, middling sorts, I guess you'd say. My dad was a skilled technician. He never graduated college. He worked on a lot of big machines, like at steel mills or power plants. So I think I got an awareness of that world a little bit through him and his work. But he was a fairly recent immigrant to the United States. He was born in Scotland, so his dad was a working class laborer in Glasgow, working in the chemical industry, shipyards. On my mom's side, same thing. Her dad migrated also from Scotland, so and he was an iron worker. So and I traced a little bit back, and then pretty much everybody that I can find on that side was somehow involved in iron work or shipyards and laborers. So I've got a long history, pedigree from that. For the women in the family, a lot of them migrated over to Canada and the United States from Europe, mostly Scotland. And they worked a lot of in textile mills, so which is a common labor, right, for a lot of women workers. So kind of in my background, I don't know if that's what led me to want to study labor and politics, but it might have been, as a way to kind of connect to that history that I have. So, but I came into kind of the study of working class America mostly through government and political interests. So for me, coming into graduate school and living in the the 1980s, going to the 90s, I wanted to figure out what had happened, what was going on that led to this collapse of this system, right, that had been in place for 40 or 50 years. How did America turn from a place that seemed to agree on a lot of things to a place that seemed to be divided on a lot of things? And the economic shifts, right, that were going on in the 1980s especially. So I kind of came at it from a presentist interest in what was happening. So my first book, Community Left Behind, focused on some of the early efforts by the federal government to deal with things like urban unemployment, poverty in Appalachia, deindustrialization in cities like Cleveland, Youngstown, and elsewhere. So, and I just I think coming to teach at Akron, that just reinforced all those things that I've been thinking about and writing about. And since being at Akron, I've been there for 20 years now. Like you with your students, I really have gotten a good sense of them and their background. A lot of them are first generation students, coming to college from working class backgrounds. They're working in the gig economy, trying to make a go of it, right? And so, my interest and connection and my background, I think, is a good match for, a lot of students I teach. So, and since then, I've done some public history work, a lot of oral history as well. I did a lot of projects with students interviewing, say, former rubber workers in Akron, about their experience with deindustrialization and what they've been doing since. And that has been really beneficial and enlightening for me to kind of get into that world a little bit more. So, and then in the last few years, I've kind of gone into studying deindustrialization a little bit more deeply. I'm involved now in a project that's transnational examination of deindustrialization. So I'm working with folks in Canada, in the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and we're looking at kind of common connections and differences in the experience of deindustrialization in different industries, in steel, coal, textiles, etc. So, and a lot of our interest is kind of in the current situation, like how did we get to Donald Trump? How did we get to Brexit? How did we get to the rise of kind of right-wing nationalist parties in France and other places? And what is the connection between deindustrialization or the economic restructuring of these North American worlds and the rise of this type of politics? So we're looking at that. We're interested in not only the politics, but also the environmental issues, the racial issues, the gender issues. We're looking at musical, artistic expression, right? How working class communities have expressed these ideas and these ideologies through art and music, etc. So it's a really interesting project. We're just a couple of years into it. So a lot of my current work will be kind of publishing, when we get to that point, all those things. So that's kind of my short history of kind of getting to here tonight and what I've been studying, what my background is. So I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody here with questions and comments. Thanks.
I have a few questions prepared, but I think maybe it's best just to kind of start by opening it up and see if you have any questions for our panelists.
I'll start.
Yeah.
So you were talking earlier about messaging, right? And the ways in which students internalize. I mean, Justin Guest, who did some work here at Youngstown, a sociologist, calls Youngstown a post-traumatic city, right? And I guess I'm wondering, where does the messaging come from? You know what I mean? Where does that messaging come from that says your community is less than, you are somewhat responsible? And what's that connection to broader institutions, political, economic development, labor?
Well, I'll start. You can just drive to the south side, drive down Market Street sometimes. You drive through neighborhoods. You see your neighbors, you see people leaving, you see businesses closing, so you have all these material issues going around, neighborhood issues going around. And then you look at national media and how national media portrays what we call the Rust Belt, right? And that term comes in vogue in the 1970s to sort of identify our regional failure, right? Because rust is the beginning part of decay, right? And I think those two are very strong. And then within family structures as well, right? As families, as parents struggle to find jobs to support their children, right? To send them to school, to send them to university, to give them the opportunities that they had hoped perhaps that they could give them before the deindustrialization took away the better wages, the lack of union recognition. I mean, I think it's a combination of a variety of forces that are cultural as well as social that sort of discourage young people from saying, I deserve something better than this, right? That I can't do better than this because I'll never leave this neighborhood. I'll never leave this, or you don't want to leave the neighborhood. You don't want to leave your community. You don't want to flee and run away. But when there's not a lot of opportunity where you are, you have a difficult choice to make, I think. Gregory?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I can just add a little bit. I think the oral histories portray a lot of that as well from workers and families. But I'm thinking too, it made me think a lot about the Great Depression, which I know you've obviously written a study a lot about. And in the Great Depression, right, in the 30s, we had a very similar development, right? A lot of workers, male workers in particular, internalized the crisis, right, as their fault. They lost their job in the mill or the factory because their character flaw, something they did. It was common, right, across this region, across the country. So I think there's historical roots to how that happens. One, thinking again about this a little bit more, there is a very deep individualistic cultural, reservoir right, in the United States that distinguishes the United States from other places. So that may be part of the messaging as well, right, as we are groomed, taught from a very early age about it's an individualistic achievement, a meritocracy, all this, right? And so when something big happens, like steel mills close or a recession, whatever, the individualistic ethos is so strong that it's hard to kind of challenge that, I guess. So that would be part of my thinking on that too. It's a really good question.
And to add, since you brought up the Great Depression, the difference between then and now, or then and the last 20 years, is those workers, those male workers in the early part of the Depression did feel alienated and isolated, but the rise of unions, the CIO, the creation of unions gave them a sense of solidarity, right? Just like in the swing bands, it created a sense of solidarity, and so their sense of alienation was, dealt with because they were with brothers and sisters in unionization. When the mills began closing here, and in the 40 years that came afterwards with the decline of unions, this individualist market ethos really evaporated. And so these workers found themselves alone. There wasn't that support group.
And then the other social institutions are also
Right.
weakening. Churches, schools, picnics, all that stuff, yeah. So I think it just feeds on itself, yeah, so it's a good point. Robert's question.
Hey, we have vested interests in General Motors. How can you compare, Black Monday, we lost 5,000 workers at one time, up to 20, 30,000, right? When GM closed, when we hired there was 15,000 people out there.
Right.
But when it closed, it wasn't that big impact. Can you compare and contrast those two?
No, you got this one. I'm gonna keep this in the family.
Well, brother, I think what happened is General Motors, they dripped unemployment. They drifted in an era after, and one of the things that when you and I started there in 1977, we saw that by the time we were negotiating our first contract in 79, 2 years after the bid was there, that was the first concession contract that we had to sign. UAW, we did, right? Remember, we had to take the cost of living, they eliminated the cost of living increase, they raised our rates for insurance. I mean, that was the first one. We were told that, in order to keep the jobs in the valley, in order to keep works down here, we had to take a concession contract. And that continued all the way through. And they would do small things, General Motors. They would stop, some of the offline work they would send out to ship it out to somebody, to a contractor outside of the facility. And so over a period of 40 years, they reduced the population of the factory to the point where when they finally closed down, 4,000 workers? 4,000 workers from 17,000. And that doesn't include, remember, Anchor Freight. Remember, they would ship all the cars, those blue car things. They would do it. That was part of General Motors as well. And all of the industries that were around the General Motors facilities that were off-site that supplied, they shipped those all off as well. And so it's really about the shift in ideology from that collective identity that comes out of the New Deal era to this much more, and again, that first quote I read by Jefferson Cowie that illuminates that, to the market economy that comes with the late 1970s and the Reagan era and every era after that, even Democrats as well. This idea that the market will fix the problem and that once these jobs go down, other jobs will rise up that will replace them, but they just didn't happen, did they? So that's why it happened. It was a whimper rather than a bang. A whimper rather than a bang.
No, that's a good answer.
You could add more too.
No, you have the experience, so I can't really say much to that. But I do think the general, the timing and when it happened is different, right? In the 1970s, you had the massive layoffs, right? The numbers were there. You still had, I think, that weakening, but still a good sense of that sort of collectiveness that had grown out in the 30s and 40s. Whereas today, I don't think that's true. I think the political culture is different, right? So, and the power that a place like Ohio, Youngstown has isn't what it used to be, right? So if a place does close, I think outside of this region, there's not as much concern or care about that. Whereas if it happened in an earlier era, when the political power was stronger, maybe there was a stronger reaction. But I think the politics, to me, are very different now. And again, I think, where we've been in the last 10 years, that's good news, right? That's the market working. So get over it. That's the attitude I feel that is out there. Yeah. At least that's my sense of it.
And we're sitting in Harry Michel's classroom. He was a tremendous advocate for this area.
Yeah.
Well, he was senator from the state of Ohio. And because we had power as a region, as a steelmaking region, we don't have power.
Me?
Sure.
I have two questions but I'm gonna ask this question now and another question later. I'm interested in the way that you're talking about the political power of that time and versus the type of power that this region has now, which is a sort of symbolic power on a national stage, and the way in which Youngstown and Morristown is framed within national, international media as a story about something, right? Like working class political anger or racial politics or what have you. And, every 2 to 4 years, presidential hopefuls come trotting out to the few remaining diners that exist in our area and sit at them and talk about how they're gonna bring the jobs back, right? I'm interested in what those media stories are doing. And if, Youngstown is in some level like doomed to be this sort of punching bag in perpetuity, or if the fact that we've now gone completely red no longer makes that salient sort of open question about the future of white working class political identity.
Excellent question.
I think you're right about the need for a story, right? So Youngstown has an arc, and it's an arc that I think a lot of academics as well as mainstream media want to kind of maintain and use, if that works. And so I think that is part of what's going on. There's assumptions about the place and stereotypes that are built in and get maintained, as to politicians dropping in and promising stuff, that goes on all the time, right? But neither political party has an answer, right? The Democrats maybe had an answer, perhaps 40, 50 years ago, maybe. But even then, I'm not sure they had much of an answer at that point. And the Republicans certainly have an answer. It's what we just talked about, right? That's the market. So I don't think either major party has an answer, even to what is going on. And I think that has generated, in part, some of that angst you mentioned right in your question about where do people go to get their voices heard and their concerns met when neither of the major parties is a vehicle for that. What happens when that's going on? And that's part of the Youngstown story. That's part of a larger story, Stephanie. Across the upper Midwest, right, the industrial Midwest. You're seeing that in Michigan, where do you want? Michigan, right, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, all of those places. So, and so I think that is part of the explanation to a little bit about your question. That helped free you from getting to where you were going.
Yes.
Good.
And just to add on, when General Motors closed, how quickly they came up with other options for it. So in order to sort of take away any, Youngstown is still in this, Mahoney Valley is still in decline. No. Quickly, we're going to resell it and we're going to make electric trucks out there. And that's going to re-employ people. And then General Motors agreed to build a battery manufacturing plant in the region. So General Motors felt guilty about it and decided that they were going to go ahead and create a factory out there to sort of ease it as well. And I think that comes from the culture in which we live in, where we don't expect government to provide solutions to problems. We expect business and industry, it's solving a problem for us.
If I can follow up, just because what you just said, do you think General Motors felt guilty, or do you think they
Political
sufficiently
pressure.
weakened the union power?
Political pressure. It had nothing to do with the union. It was all about political pressure. Because they're an international company. And as an international company, they have to operate within the structures of government policy. And, they had gotten a huge amount of money as a result of the bank failures in 2008, 2012, then again with COVID. And so they had dirt all over their hands. And they couldn't say, oh, well, we got all this money, but now we're closing the factory. So, and that's where the political pressure came from. But it wasn't political pressure in the traditional way in which we see politicians addressing problems of our society, but rather political pressure to step in as a business to save rather than as government to save. Whereas in the 1930s, of course, it was the government that stepped in to help save things. That's the difference that I see.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll change gears away from our discussion just for a moment to introduce our panelist, Dr. Stephanie Shaw.
I think that's not really fair to them.
No. Like I said, we're casual and relaxed here this evening. We're just so glad that you're able to join us, Dr. Shaw. Dr. Shaw is a professor of history at The Ohio State University, and her research focuses on women and on Black Americans. She's an award-winning author of numerous publications. I'll just mention a few, including What a Woman Ought to Be and Do, Black Professional Women Workers During the Jim Crow Era, and W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk. She's currently working on a new book project, tentatively titled Grandmothers, Granny Women, and Old Aunts, Rethinking Slave Families and Communities in the 19th Century South. So Dr. Shaw, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and your research, and then again, we welcome any questions for any of our panelists.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here tonight, for coming, period, and for still being here. I know why you're still here, because of these guys. And I'm really picking myself because I wanted to hear what they had to say.
Gems, all
Because
gems.
I'm
Gold.
because I'm a pretend labor historian. They are real ones. And I really wanted to hear what they had to say. And I'm really sorry, and I can tell you what happened. I left my hotel, which is like 8 minutes from here, at like 20 minutes till 6. And I just found my place. And it's just crazy. You won't believe it, so I'm not gonna try. But I really am happy to be here. And so I don't know if I need to say anything else about me. You said it,
Okay.
So let me just say, one of the reasons that I think I was invited here is because I do work on Black working women. And in this case, I'm going to talk about these Black lower level professional women workers. These women who were social workers, nurses, librarians, and school teachers, the sort of typical female occupations. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to hear what they had to say so much was because, although I used to read a lot of labor history, I don't anymore. But it was labor history that helped me think about how to write about these women, because they didn't fit any of the patterns that I expected they would fit. They're not, well, I'll just leave it there. They didn't fit any of the patterns I thought they would fit. One of the patterns that I thought they would fit was the one that was sensationalized by E. Franklin Frazier. These Black middle class people and elites. He wrote a scathing book about them called Black Bourgeoisie, and in that book, basically, they were self-centered, elite snobs, didn't care about anybody except themselves, and so on. And I thought that that's what I was going to find. And I imagined that I was going to write Black bourgeoisie over, but better. It's the arrogance of youth. Probably because I couldn't have done that, even if I had found that evidence. But the reason I couldn't do it was because that's not the evidence I found. what I found was women who in their families, communities, and schools were socialized to be these interesting, complex, socially responsible individuals, socially responsible women who did take care of themselves and their families, but who also did a lot of work to take care of everybody else. And I use Robert Bella, who's a sociologist. I use Bella's label, socially responsible individualism. You know, this idea that you can take care of yourself first. You can be an individualist and also socially responsible. And that is how these women live their lives. And so I really wanted to know, first of all, you know, where did that come from? You know, because they are so different from, these women did not start out middle class. Well, some of them did, and a few of them started out quite elite, you know, where children and families had quite a lot. But most of them were from poor working class families. But anyway, so I paid attention to their families, how they were brought up, the schools they went to, you know, what did they learn in schools, and the communities they grew up in, what patterns did they see there. And basically everywhere you look, these women were being prepared to be able to take care of themselves, first and foremost. But they were also prepared to assume responsibility for the whole community. And you probably have heard this expression, race women and race men. And I think it was more than that. It was more than just, I'm black and they're black and we have to look out for each other. I think it's more than that notion, that late 19th century notion of racial uplift. I think it's a lot more than that. I really do think that their upbringing resulted in a kind of consciousness, you know, that just shaped everything that they did. And, you know, it came from everybody. It came from people in the home, people in the community, people in the school. And so I'm gonna read you, I wrote a whole thing here, but it would be shameless for me to try to present them. It would be just terrible, actually. But I do want to read maybe two little quotes that came from people from the community. They were not, one was a teacher of the girl, the other was a minister. And this will give you an idea of how profound, I think, even in the community, that kind of socialization was going on. There was a minister who wrote a recommendation letter for this young woman to go to, I think it was the University of Atlanta. And he, let me just find it because I can't do justice to it if I don't actually read it. Anyway, he's from Pensacola, Florida, the 6th Avenue Baptist Church. And the woman's name was Fressie Bell. The congregation of the church paid her tuition. And they were convinced that she will be, quote, a credit to her community, a defender of her race, and a general benefactor to mankind. And that's a whole lot of stuff, you know? That's some of them are a lot heavier than that. You know, and it was a heavy load for an 17, 18-year-old going off to school, thinking that she was responsible for all of that. There's a second letter that I really want to find here. Here it is. This letter came from a person who wrote for a student who was going to Tuskegee. And he described her as an active member of the group that had raised the money to pay for the church that she was a congregant of, and also the piano in the church. And she was the person who actually organized the work for raising the money and buying the piano. He ended that letter by saying that he was writing this letter, not on his own. He was writing this letter by order of the entire Sunday school and church. So you see this sort of collective consciousness reinforcement over and over. That's actually not the one that I wanted to read, but I wanted to read the most, and I'm not sure I'll find it fast enough. But anyway, another example, and I'm sorry, these are all the examples, like these examples all come from the community rather than these other places, but trust me, they really do reinforce this. It starts in the home. It spreads to the community, and it's in the school, and they're all saying some of the same things. The last example I'll give is for one girl who was on her way to college. These are people who often lived in rural communities where there was not even a high school that Black kids could go to. So they had to leave home to go to school. So somebody had to help, get them there, had to find a place for them to live, do all these things. Anyway, this one woman, her community had raised the money for her to go to college, not just normal school, but college. And one person had assumed responsibility for paying her train fare to the city where the college was. They all did this because she was the #1 student in her class. They couldn't afford to send their kids to college themselves, but altogether they could send somebody's kid who had the most potential. And they did. They put together change. In some instances, people put, 25 cents in this pot. Anyway, she gets to the train station. The person who's supposed to pay the train fare doesn't show up at all. And it's getting closer to time to leave, to board the train. They're still not there. All of these people from the community who came to the train station to send her off, to see her off and send her off, they were very proud of her. They started taking up money among themselves and among the people who were standing on the platform, and that kind of thing until they got that train fare. And you see it over and over and over. So I'll stop here, but I used to wonder why did they do it? They had to do everything in these communities, a lot of stuff, and I wonder why they may just leave. Why didn't they just leave, go somewhere else, get something that's a little bit easier? And I know now why. They really couldn't, and would consciously. So that's all I'll say.
I have a question.
And I really am. Go for it. And I really am embarrassed that you all, I think you should be asking them. I really want to hear what they're.
Where do these, your women that you study, where are they coming from?
They came from everywhere, but the majority of them probably came from the south, east of the Mississippi, but all over the south and the mid-south, up to Tennessee, Kentucky. A couple of Midwestern women, Michigan, Ohio, a handful of Northeastern women, particularly Philadelphia, Massachusetts. Those are the ones I can think of. But there were even just a couple maybe one from Los Angeles and one from Texas. I can't remember all of the places where they came from, but they were scattered. They came from a lot of places. Because there are very few women like these women that you're gonna find records about at all, archival records. So I went where they were, and fortunately, a group of these women, I think Radcliffe had recently, like in the early 80s, done a Black women's oral history project. And so 3 or 4 of these women were in that. The one from Los Angeles was, I can't remember which others were. I went to all of the obvious archives, Atlanta University, Fisk, Tuskegee, Howard, the main historically Black colleges, all over the South really, and looked for people there. students in particular. And Tuskegee has this incredible archive. All the recommendation letters are still there. Every single one of them, I think, but a whole lot of them, boxes and boxes. And so you find those who are going to end up teaching or in social work or something like that. The people whose names I had learned just doing research in those occupations, I started looking for papers for them. So they were scattered all over the place. Now there are a bunch of these projects, that document the lives of women like these. But at that time, they really weren't a lot.
One of the things sort of, I think everyone sort of touched on this evening is this idea of consciousness building and, identity raising. And so I guess I'm interested, if some of the sense of collective worker identities, we were speaking earlier in an industrial context, has been maybe sort of lost or changed since deindustrialization. I'm wondering if that sense of, that community imperative that was driving these Black professional women, if that sort of sense of community identity still exists, or if it's, changed over time too. That drive to represent not only yourself, but this community, does that still exist?
I'm gonna resist letting you get me started. I'll say I hope so. But I'm really worried about it. I'm worried about it with my young colleagues. I have to say young men. Talk about academic entrepreneurship. And I'm like, oh God. It scares me. So I don't know, but I hope so. I know it exists in places. Let me just say that. I know it does exist. I know people who are like that, who are like these women. But I also see a lot that worries me. I don't know. I really can't answer that question, to be honest. I don't know. I don't see it as much. And I think part of it is that the communities themselves are so different. And people read this as a pro-segregationist argument. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just saying, I'm just observing, one of the consequences of a segregated community. When the Black community could only live in this part of town, and when everything, that they did generally took place in that part of town, this outcome is not that surprising. And, and now that everybody can live almost anywhere they can afford to live, people don't have the same community relationship. They don't have, at least that's what I tend to see, that people don't have the same kind of relationship to the community where they live that they had at that time. Because I don't think I know it wasn't just these women who had that kind of connection to the community. It was that they were the ones who made it, into these occupations, that I was looking into and that I found. But every person who was on that train station platform, who on any given day of the week probably couldn't have produced 25 or 35 cents from their pocket, you can tell that they felt that way too. But yet I'm still gonna not call it just race consciousness. It's something else. These girls, their parents came out of the Victorian age, and whether or not they had access to all the accoutrement, that a Victorian lady had available to her, they did talk about a couple of things. Morals and manners first, and then culture and character. And I think that when they talked about character, they were talking about this, you know, and I think that I think it goes beyond race. So I don't think it's just race women. I think it is that, but it's way more than that.
I have a question kind of following up to this, and maybe everybody could flip on it. I just came back from New Orleans. I was at the American Studies Conference, which was great. And I had the privilege to go to the second line, and, you know, the second lines are run by these fraternal societies, Black fraternal sorority societies that have been running, you know, since the 19th century as mutual aid and pleasure societies. And I was wondering, you know, one of the things that's sort of speaks to what you're just talking about is the way in which mutual aid and, you know, collective solidarity for support for somebody who's been injured or somebody who's deceased is such a huge function of specifically the early 20th century before we had Social Security and all of these sort of programs. But I'm wondering if you know, what the constitution of those type of mutual aid societies were around the types of women that you are writing about, and if you see any kind of mutual aid societies that are forming now in kind of 21st century class consciousness, like, you know, is GoFundMe the new, like, you know, I'm serious, like, it's a sad world that we live in, but those are formations that exist to help working class people come through difficult times.
I think that's, I mean, I like the question a lot. I don't see a lot, but I also am not really looking for, when I see it, I notice it, I take note. But it's not something that I'm working on and looking for, you know. But I don't know, maybe the Black Lives Matter movement is what that looks like today. You know, I don't know that, but maybe. But, you know, in these women's lifetimes, and these women were born from between just before slavery ended to about the 1920s. That's about the, you know, when they were born. And mutual aid was sometimes the only way that certain things could get done. I mean, these women, you know, one of the things about these women in terms of the work that they did, I like to say that the work they did bore no resemblance whatsoever to what the job description looked like, you know, the formal job description. And I think that, you know, they was engaged in a whole different work culture than the work culture of teachers or the work culture of, you know, nurses or whatever. Because these women had to build the schools very often. They had to collect the money to build the schools. Or if they had a building, you know, it could, you know, some, you know, really ragged building that might have had a pot-bellied stove in the middle of the floor. It would have been 1 room or 2 room, and might not have even had that. You know, they had to provide the supplies for the school. You know, not unlike a lot of teachers in a lot of places today. And they just did it, you know, but they didn't stop there. They didn't just teach an elementary school teacher, didn't just teach, you know, elementary age kids. They also taught those kids' parents. Because in the South, in the deep South, their parents were more likely than not in the early period to live with. They taught parents too, you know, but they helped to raise the money and to finance and to build the institutions that the community needed. So not just schools, but hospitals, old folks' homes, nursing homes, they call them old folks' homes, orphanages. They did that. They helped to do that, you know, and then they also did the kinds of care among the family members of their students that teachers don't do today. They do a lot, but that's not something that they do. Their parents, their fathers especially, were fraternal society members. Some of these girls were daughters of Ruth, you know, and Eastern Star. They were members of these organizations. As more and more go to college, it's the sororities, you know, and also the women's clubs, and they were very active in the women's club, in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And then, the one that came next, the one that, Mary Cotton founded, National Council of Negro Women. They were very active in those. But I think that the need for those kinds of organizations isn't as great now, or doesn't seem to be as great now. Maybe it is still as great, but it doesn't seem to be as great. So I don't know if I have any friends who are involved in organizations like that. Half of them are in sororities, that kind of thing. They probably pay membership to the NAACP or something. But they're in professional organizations now, the AHA, the OAH, the Southern, ASLH. And I'm sure that the equivalent organizations for nurses and librarians and school teachers, the MEA, those kinds of things. I don't know, but that's a great question. But I do think that because of the way society is organized now, because segregation is gone, and because so many people saw getting out of that Black community as a sign of success, I think a lot of that is lost. It might come through the churches, but I'm not even sure of that.
I think the idea of mutual aid differs from when those organizations were created in New Orleans and organizations in the early part of the 20th century were created, the idea of mutual aid and even unions and the way it's defined now. And so I think you're right, GoFundMe and other social media means are ways to create a collective identity, but it's based in individualism rather than a mutual identity. And it's that individualism that really drives. And so the word mutual doesn't quite define it anymore, or it has a different definition, right?
It's not called GoFund, that's sweet.
That's right, it's not called, excellent. It's not GoFund us, it's GoFund, and that's really good. And I think that would be my take on it.
And I think along that same line, I'm not sure it's a mutual identity. It's a collective interest rather than an identity. And people have an interest in supporting this cause or this person or this thing, whatever it is, somebody's house, the floods and wherever they took place. They want to send money to these people, or to help. And maybe to particular individuals, somebody lost their job and is about to lose their house. I think that the people who respond to that have a similar interest, but not necessarily a similar identity. And I suspect that if they all met each other in the same room, half of them wouldn't talk to the other half. I think the interests are so strong, and I think that identities are strong as well. And the identities of these people might keep them from being together, but their interests could draw them together, and their identities can push them apart. That's what I think.
I was curious in the archival materials, and forgive me if I didn't get this. Do you have any sense of what those returns were like? Sort of once you leave your community, it's certainly a common working class phenomenon, right? You leave your working class roots, you go elsewhere and then you return, and there's a different kind of alienation. You don't quite fit in, something that is double behind. Is there any evidence of that in the archival record? Those kinds of struggles with returning.
I can't remember more than a couple who went back to where they came from. One person who went back to where she came from was September Clark, and nothing about her life changed. Nothing. She went. When she lost her job. Well, first of all, she taught men Black working class men how to read on the school bus, you know. And in her sister-in-law or cousin's beauty shop, you know, and they used, you know, dry cleaning, they were paper bags from laundromats and dry cleaners to write the lessons on and those kinds of things. And she taught, you know, in the Sea Islands. She was not allowed to teach in the city, in the public schools, the city schools. So these are schools that they had to also have fund, you know, and, but in the 1920s, she was one of the people involved in petitioning. They didn't just start out suing, but they petitioned the city to hire Black women school teachers in the Charleston public schools. Because the Charleston public schools, only white women who work there and white men. And the women were even teaching the Black kids. Black women couldn't get a job in public school. And they were successful, you know, and she was engaged, you know, a couple of decades later in actually suing for equal pay for Black women compared to white women. You know, and then, you know, she ends up going off with SCLC and Highlander School and, you know, and Martin Luther King and all of that. She went back home and she clearly had no problem adjusting to the community, and they had no problem accepting her, you know, but I can't think right now of any others who went back to the same place. I just can't remember. This book is like 30 years old. And my memory is not what it used to be. It's not just my eyes, my memory too.
I didn't hear her name. What was her name again?
Septima Clark,
Okay.
Septima, and she has an autobiography called Ready from Within. And there's been a recent book that came out about her, by a woman whose name I'm gonna get wrong, but I think it's Cynthia Freeman. She's a writer, not a historian. And I would read September's Ready from Within. That's what I would read first. But there's some new details in that book because she interviewed Clark a lot. So there's some new stuff there, but most of it is also in the autobiography.
Just as an addition, I just finished an article on Joe Louis, boxer. He's 23 years old, becomes heavyweight champion. The same values that are imposed on these young women who are being sent off are the ones that the Black intelligentsia are putting upon Joe Louis. That he's going to be a standard bearer for the race, he's going to represent us well, and it's going to, you know, resonate back to the community. So he's very much driven by that same that mentality. For a 23-year-old with very limited educational background, it was a lot of responsibility that he was able to carry. And he did so, I think, with a lot of respect.
I feel like I'm quashing a really wonderful conversation, but we're, you know, sort of taking up over the hour mark, so I don't want to keep you guys any longer this evening. So I guess I'll just ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it. I'm sure our panelists will be happy to, you know.
And I just want to say, I truly am sorry.
It's okay. That's not.
We're so glad you got here.
I'm very,
Do you know me well?
Youngstown's such a big city.
It's not a good system.
Well, there's all kinds of great
Oh, I know,
construction
yeah, I
downtown.
know.
It's just a nightmare. I was just so worried that something happened on the highway.
I sent you an
Still playing. So.
Like this is their party. Please let me.
What's the name?
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry to introduce Dr. Gregory Wilson and Dr. Kenneth Bindas.
Okay.
Well, there's no OSD, Students Association. They're really strong state organization, and they have big money and they have. Those are the white stickers. I mean, it's great, but it isn't a conversation, and it's a political ideology. And remember, as a high Students Association, great organization, it's umbrella.
I know.
Yeah, but it's just helping students advocate for things within their campus that can change, and helping. Yeah. I like this.
Yeah, there's a lot of. I'm not the farmer's market right now, it's closed now, but if you're around next time, I can see something.
Well, good, but yeah, so. Mrs. Jam.
Well, I was, yeah.
I'm an executive.
Rural sociology.
Sociology, working class. We look at agriculture as it is. We grew out of, Stockton was one of our actual county members. We grew out of the
Associated specifically with, well, the